Greenfield, Oregon, October 15th, 1993. On a crisp autumn Friday afternoon in Greenfield, Oregon, 24-year-old Jennifer Mitchell walked through the automatic doors of Wilson's Market on Maple Street, just as she had done countless times before. The young mother had dropped her 3-year-old daughter Emma at her mother's house earlier that morning, planning to complete her weekly grocery shopping without the usual distractions of a curious toddler. It was a routine errand that should have taken no more than an hour. Jennifer would never return home. The Wilson's Market occupied a prominent corner in Greenfield's modest downtown area, serving as a gathering place for the community of just over 15,000 residents. That particular Friday saw typical mid-afternoon traffic, with shoppers moving through aisles stocked with autumn produce and early holiday decorations. Security cameras mounted near the entrance, and at several key locations throughout the store recorded grainy black and white footage of customers going about their ordinary business. So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from. Jennifer's husband, David Mitchell, had kissed his wife goodbye that morning before heading to his construction job on the outskirts of town. The couple had been married for 5 years and lived in a small ranch-style home on Elm Street. David expected Jennifer home by early afternoon, with dinner plans for the evening and a quiet weekend ahead. When 3 o'clock passed without any word from his wife, David felt the first stirrings of concern. By 4 o'clock, that concern had transformed into genuine worry. Store employees discovered Jennifer's shopping cart abandoned in aisle 7, near the dairy section. Her brown leather purse sat in the child seat, contents undisturbed. Her handwritten grocery list, marked with careful check marks for items already collected, lay folded beside a carton of milk that had begun to warm. Her car keys remained in an interior pocket of the purse. Nothing appeared stolen or disturbed, yet Jennifer herself had simply vanished. The store manager contacted local police at approximately 4:15 that afternoon after David Mitchell arrived at the store searching for his wife. Officers from the Greenfield Police Department responded within minutes, immediately recognizing the unusual nature of the situation. Women did not simply disappear from grocery stores in broad daylight, leaving behind their belongings and half-completed shopping. The initial response treated the incident with appropriate urgency. Witnesses interviewed that evening provided fragmentary information. A cashier named Patricia remembered seeing Jennifer enter the store around 2:30, offering a friendly wave as the young mother passed the checkout lanes. An elderly customer recalled noticing Jennifer examining produce near the front of the store, selecting apples and placing them carefully in her cart. Another shopper mentioned seeing a young woman matching Jennifer's description near the back of the store, speaking with a man in the refrigerated section, though this witness could provide few details about the man's appearance. The Greenfield Police Department launched an immediate search of the area surrounding Wilson's Market. Officers checked nearby businesses, alleyways, and parking areas. They interviewed employees and customers who had been present during the relevant time window. David Mitchell provided recent photographs of his wife, describing what she had been wearing that day: a blue denim jacket over a white cotton shirt, dark jeans, and white sneakers. Her shoulder-length brown hair had been pulled back in a ponytail. She wore her wedding ring and a small silver watch, but no other jewelry of significance. As darkness fell over Greenfield that October evening, search efforts expanded to include volunteers from the community. Jennifer's family members arrived at the police station, desperate for information and hoping for any sign of the missing young mother. Her parents, Margaret and Charles Wilson, could offer no explanation for their daughter's disappearance. Jennifer had been in good spirits that morning, excited about Emma's upcoming 4th birthday party planned for the following month. There had been no arguments with David, no financial troubles, no indication whatsoever that Jennifer might choose to leave her life behind. The investigation team examined Jennifer's background thoroughly, searching for any detail that might explain her sudden absence. They found a woman deeply devoted to her family, active in her church community, and well-liked by neighbors and friends. Her bank accounts showed no unusual activity. There were no secret relationships, no hidden debts, no evidence of any circumstance that might prompt a voluntary disappearance. Every indication suggested that Jennifer Mitchell had been a content young mother looking forward to her future, not someone planning to abandon her life. By midnight on October 15th, the Greenfield Police Department had officially classified Jennifer Mitchell's disappearance as a missing person case with suspicious circumstances. The FBI field office in Portland was notified, given the possibility of abduction. Local news stations prepared stories for their morning broadcasts, and newspapers began drafting articles about the mysterious vanishing. In a town like Greenfield, where serious crime remained relatively rare, Jennifer's disappearance sent shockwaves through the community. The weekend brought intensive search efforts throughout Greenfield and surrounding areas. Volunteers organized into teams, combing through parks, wooded areas, and vacant properties. Police interviewed dozens of people who had been anywhere near Wilson's Market on that Friday afternoon. Yet despite these extensive efforts, investigators found themselves with remarkably few concrete leads. Jennifer Mitchell had seemingly evaporated into thin air, leaving behind only questions and a community gripped by fear and confusion. As days turned into weeks, the case began its slow, inevitable slide toward the cold case files. Without a body, without witnesses to an actual crime, without any physical evidence of foul play, investigators found themselves unable to build a case or identify a suspect. The grainy security footage from Wilson's Market showed Jennifer entering the store and moving through the aisles, but the limited camera coverage and poor image quality provided little useful information. The investigation had reached a dead end, and somewhere in Greenfield, someone knew exactly what had happened to Jennifer Mitchell on that autumn afternoon. That secret would remain hidden for 30 years, waiting in a box of forgotten evidence for someone to finally see what others had missed. Greenfield, Oregon, March 2023. Thomas Reynolds had spent the better part of 3 decades working in various capacities for the Greenfield Police Department, though he had never worn a badge or carried a gun. At 58 years old, Thomas served as a security officer and evidence custodian at the department's storage facility, a nondescript warehouse on the industrial edge of town where boxes of old case files, physical evidence, and outdated equipment accumulated like sediment from the passing years. It was quiet work, suited to a man who preferred solitude and order, far removed from the chaos of active investigations. The department had recently received a grant to digitize decades of old evidence and case files, part of a statewide initiative to modernize record-keeping and create searchable databases of cold cases. Thomas had been assigned the painstaking task of cataloging and organizing materials before they could be sent to a specialized facility for digital conversion. This meant opening boxes that had remained sealed for years, sometimes decades, and methodically documenting their contents. Most days, the work proved monotonous and unremarkable. March 17th, however, would be different. Thomas had been working through a section of storage dedicated to cases from the early 1990s, a period when the department had been in transition between paper records and early computer systems. Many cases from that era existed in a frustrating hybrid state, with some materials digitized and others remaining only in physical form. He pulled a cardboard box marked with faded handwriting from a metal shelf, the label reading, Mitchell, Jennifer, Missing Person, 1993. The name triggered a distant memory, a case he vaguely recalled from his early days working at the department. Inside the box, Thomas found the expected materials, typed police reports, witness statements, photographs of the missing woman, and maps of search areas. What caught his attention, however, was a smaller box nested inside, containing several VHS tapes in plastic cases. The labels indicated these were security recordings from Wilson's Market, dated October 15th through October 17th of 1993. Thomas frowned as he examined the tapes, wondering why they had been stored here rather than being thoroughly analyzed and documented in the case file. The evidence log indicated that the tapes had been reviewed by investigators in October of 1993, with notes suggesting nothing of evidentiary value had been discovered. However, Thomas noticed something peculiar. The log showed that only the tape from October 15th had been checked out multiple times for review. The tapes from the following 2 days appeared to have been examined only once, briefly, before the entire set had been boxed and stored. This struck Thomas as odd, though he could not immediately articulate why. The warehouse maintained several outdated VCR units specifically for reviewing old evidence tapes. Thomas carried the box to a workstation equipped with one of these machines, connected to a modern monitor for better viewing quality. He had learned over the years that even when cases had been thoroughly investigated, a fresh pair of eyes sometimes noticed details that others had missed. The passage of time and advancement of technology also meant that footage once considered too poor for analysis might yield new information when viewed with modern equipment and techniques. Thomas began with the tape from October 15th, the day Jennifer Mitchell disappeared. The footage was indeed grainy and of poor quality, typical of early 1990s security systems. The timestamp in the corner showed the recording beginning at 6 in the morning, with the tape set to record in time-lapse mode to conserve space. This meant the footage jumped in increments, showing a few seconds of action before skipping forward, creating a jerky, disjointed viewing experience. He watched Jennifer Mitchell enter Wilson's Market at 2:28 in the afternoon, pushing a shopping cart through the automatic doors. The camera angle, mounted high near the entrance, captured her arrival clearly enough. She wore the clothing described in the police reports: denim jacket, white shirt, dark jeans. Her ponytail swung as she moved, and she appeared relaxed and unhurried. Thomas felt a chill watching this young woman, unaware that she was walking toward whatever fate awaited her inside that ordinary grocery store. The market's security system had cameras positioned at the entrance, near the customer service desk, and pointing down two of the main aisles. Coverage was far from comprehensive, leaving significant blind spots throughout the store. Thomas watched Jennifer appear and disappear from camera views as she moved through her shopping routine. At 2:43, she appeared in the aisle camera near the produce section, examining apples. At 2:51, another camera briefly captured her near the dairy section at the back of the store. This was where the earlier investigators had focused their attention, and Thomas understood why. In this footage, Jennifer stood near the refrigerated cases, and a male figure appeared in the frame with her. The poor image quality and distance made it impossible to see his face clearly or determine whether they were actually interacting or merely occupying the same space. The figure moved out of frame quickly, and Jennifer continued shopping. She disappeared from that camera's view at 2:54, and she was never seen on any camera again. Thomas had reviewed this sequence multiple times, just as investigators had done 30 years earlier. The man in the footage could be anyone, could be merely another shopper, could be entirely unrelated to Jennifer's disappearance. The footage provided no clear answers, only frustrating ambiguity. However, Thomas decided to continue viewing the tape past the point where Jennifer disappeared from camera coverage, something he suspected earlier investigators had done only cursorily once they realized she was no longer visible in the store. What he discovered made him sit up straighter in his chair. At 3:11 in the afternoon, 17 minutes after Jennifer was last seen on camera inside the store, the entrance camera captured an image that previous reviewers had apparently dismissed as irrelevant. A man exited through the automatic doors, moving quickly. The camera angle and time-lapse nature of the recording made it difficult to see details, but Thomas noticed something others had missed. The man wore a dark jacket and carried what appeared to be a white plastic grocery bag, but he was not pushing a shopping cart and had apparently not used the checkout lanes, which would have been visible on the customer service camera. More significantly, Thomas observed that the timestamp on this footage aligned with the approximate time when Jennifer would have been missing from her abandoned cart. The man's hurried exit and the fact that he bypassed normal checkout procedures struck Thomas as potentially significant. He rewound and watched the sequence again, this time focusing on trying to see if the man had been visible entering the store earlier. After several reviews, Thomas found footage of someone matching the same general appearance entering the store at 2:31, just 3 minutes after Jennifer had arrived. Thomas felt his pulse quicken as he made notes of these timestamps. He then did something that apparently no one had done thoroughly before. He continued watching past Jennifer's disappearance, reviewing hours of footage from the entrance camera. At 4:37 in the afternoon, more than an hour after the man's hurried exit, the same individual returned to the store. Thomas could see him more clearly in this footage, as the man moved more slowly, and the camera captured several seconds of his approach. He appeared to be in his mid to late 20s, wearing the same dark jacket, now without the plastic bag he had been carrying earlier. This return visit corresponded with the time when store employees and David Mitchell had just discovered Jennifer's abandoned cart and contacted police. The man entered the store, remained inside for approximately 4 minutes based on the time-lapse footage, then exited again and walked toward the parking lot. Thomas's instincts, honed by decades of working with criminal investigations, told him this pattern was significant. Why would someone leave the store hurriedly in the middle of the afternoon, then return over an hour later for such a brief visit, particularly during the exact window when Jennifer's disappearance was being discovered? Thomas ejected the October 15th tape and loaded the one from October 16th. He fast-forwarded through hours of footage, watching the store's normal rhythm of customers coming and going. Then, at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, he spotted the same man entering the store again. This time, the individual moved through the entrance slowly, appearing to look around carefully before proceeding inside. The man remained in the store for 7 minutes before exiting, once again not visible using the checkout lanes. The October 17th tape showed a similar pattern. The same individual entered at 3:05 in the afternoon, spent several minutes inside, and departed without making any obvious purchases. Thomas felt certain now that this person was returning to the scene, perhaps checking on the investigation's progress or looking for something. This behavior, combined with the timeline from October 15th, suggested someone with direct involvement in Jennifer's disappearance. Thomas paused the tape and sat back in his chair, his mind working through the implications. He rewound to the clearest footage of the man and used his phone to photograph the screen, capturing the best available image of the individual's face and clothing. The quality was poor, but it was something. He then turned his attention to the parking lot footage, hoping the cameras outside might have captured vehicle information. The external cameras had even worse image quality than those inside the store, and their coverage was limited. However, Thomas's patient review was rewarded at 3:13 on October 15th, just 2 minutes after the man had exited the store hurriedly. The camera positioned to monitor the main parking area captured a dark-colored sedan pulling out quickly from a space. The angle was poor, and the time-lapse recording made the movement jerky, but Thomas could see a partial license plate. The first 3 characters appeared to be RLH before the rest became unreadable due to the angle and image quality. Thomas immediately understood the significance of this discovery. A partial license plate from 1993 could potentially be traced through Department of Motor Vehicle records, especially if combined with other identifying information like vehicle make and model. The fact that this detail had apparently been missed in the original investigation suggested that reviewers had not examined the parking lot footage carefully, perhaps assuming that without a clear view of a crime occurring, the external cameras held little value. He spent the remainder of that day documenting his findings, creating detailed notes with timestamps and descriptions of each significant sequence. He made copies of the most relevant segments onto a modern format, ensuring the evidence would be preserved. As 5 o'clock approached and his shift neared its end, Thomas gathered his documentation and prepared to take his findings to someone in the department who could act on the information. The original investigators who had worked Jennifer Mitchell's case were long retired or had moved on to other positions. The detective division had changed significantly over 3 decades, with new leadership and different personnel. Thomas knew he needed to approach someone who would take his discoveries seriously, someone who understood that cold cases sometimes broke open through exactly this kind of painstaking evidence review. Detective Sarah Coleman had joined the Greenfield Police Department's investigative unit 5 years earlier, bringing with her a reputation for thoroughness and a particular interest in cold cases. Thomas had worked with her on several evidence reviews and knew she possessed both the authority and the determination to reopen a 30-year-old missing person case if the evidence warranted it. As he locked up the evidence warehouse that evening, Thomas felt the weight of what he had discovered. Jennifer Mitchell's disappearance might finally have a lead, and somewhere in Greenfield, a man who thought he had gotten away with a terrible crime was about to discover that the past never stays buried forever. Greenfield, Oregon, April 2023. Detective Sarah Coleman arrived at her desk on the morning of April 3rd to find Thomas Reynolds waiting in the hallway outside the investigative unit. A thick folder clutched in his hands and an expression of barely contained urgency on his weathered face. The evidence custodian rarely made appearances in this part of the building, preferring to work in the quiet solitude of the warehouse. His presence alone signaled something significant, and Sarah gestured him into her office immediately, closing the door behind them as he began explaining what he had discovered in the forgotten footage from 1993. Sarah listened intently as Thomas walked her through his findings, showing her the enhanced screenshots he had prepared and his detailed timeline of the mysterious man's movements through Wilson's Market on the day Jennifer Mitchell vanished. The partial license plate information particularly caught her attention. In 1993, database searches had been far more cumbersome and time-consuming than modern systems allowed. What might have required weeks of manual record-checking 3 decades ago could now potentially be accomplished in hours through integrated DMV and law enforcement databases. Within 2 days of receiving Thomas's report, Sarah had obtained authorization to officially reopen the Jennifer Mitchell case as an active investigation. The partial plate RLH, combined with the approximate year and vehicle description, gave the department's database analysts a starting point. Oregon DMV records from 1993 were digitized and searchable, though the process required careful filtering given the limited information available. The search parameters focused on dark sedans registered in Oregon with plates beginning with those 3 letters during the relevant time period. The initial database query returned 47 possible matches. Sarah's team began the methodical process of elimination, cross-referencing each registered owner against the timeline and circumstances of Jennifer's disappearance. They excluded vehicles registered to women, elderly individuals, and anyone who had been verifiably out of state during October of 1993. They prioritized registrations with Greenfield addresses or nearby communities. By April 10th, they had narrowed the list to 12 strong possibilities. The name Robert Harrison appeared on that shortened list, and several factors immediately elevated him as a person of significant interest. Harrison's 1989 Chevrolet Corsica, dark blue in color, had carried Oregon license plate RLH 472. More significantly, employment records showed that Robert Harrison had worked at Wilson's Market from June through September of 1993, placing him intimately familiar with the store's layout, schedule, and security system. He had been terminated from that position on September 23rd, just 3 weeks before Jennifer Mitchell's disappearance. Sarah pulled Harrison's personnel file from Wilson's Market's archived records, which the store had maintained in storage. The file painted a troubling picture of an employee whose behavior had grown increasingly concerning during his brief tenure. Multiple customer complaints had been filed regarding inappropriate comments and unwanted attention from Harrison, particularly toward female shoppers. The store manager's notes described Harrison as intense and difficult to manage, someone who became fixated on certain customers and had difficulty accepting professional boundaries. The termination paperwork indicated that Harrison's dismissal had resulted from a specific incident involving a customer complaint. A woman had reported that Harrison had followed her through the store, making conversation that escalated from friendly to uncomfortably personal. When she had complained to management, Harrison had reacted with hostility toward both the customer and his supervisors. The decision to terminate his employment had been immediate, and security had been present when Harrison was informed and escorted from the premises. Sarah obtained photographs of Harrison from his employment records and driver's license from 1993. The images, while not definitive given the poor quality of the security footage, appeared consistent with the build and general appearance of the man Thomas had identified on the Wilson's Market tapes. Harrison had been 26 years old in October of 1993, matching witness descriptions of the man seen near Jennifer in the store that day. Further investigation revealed that Harrison had left Greenfield in November of 1993, barely a month after Jennifer's disappearance. He had relocated to Idaho, settling in a rural area outside the small town of Meridian. This timing struck Sarah as potentially significant, though she recognized that correlation did not equal causation. Many people moved for legitimate reasons, and Harrison's departure so soon after losing his job at Wilson's Market might have been coincidental. Sarah's team conducted deeper background research into Harrison's life before and after Jennifer's disappearance. They discovered that he had grown up in Greenfield, graduating from the local high school in 1985. His employment history showed a pattern of short-term jobs, frequent relocations, and several documented conflicts with employers and co-workers. In 1997, Harrison had been questioned by Idaho authorities regarding a separate missing person case involving a young woman from Meridian, though insufficient evidence had prevented any charges from being filed. This information sent chills through the investigative team. The possibility that Harrison might have been involved in multiple disappearances elevated the urgency of their work. Sarah requested and received case files from the Idaho investigation, looking for similarities or patterns that might connect to Jennifer Mitchell's case. While the circumstances differed in some respects, certain elements proved eerily similar. Both victims were young mothers, both had last been seen in public retail locations, and both cases had gone cold due to lack of physical evidence or witnesses to an actual crime. Bank records from October 1993, obtained through legal channels given the active investigation, showed that Harrison had made several unusual purchases in the days immediately following Jennifer's disappearance. On October 17th, he had bought a significant quantity of cleaning supplies from a hardware store in a neighboring town. On October 19th, he purchased a shovel, heavy-duty plastic sheeting, and concrete mix from a home improvement center, paying in cash according to the store's archived receipt copies. These transactions, while not inherently criminal, suggested preparation for concealing something. Sarah also discovered that Harrison had sold his Chevrolet Corsica on November 2, 1993, to a private buyer for significantly less than its market value. The quick sale and below-market price suggested someone eager to dispose of the vehicle, perhaps due to concerns about evidence it might contain. The current whereabouts of that specific vehicle remained unknown, as it had likely been resold multiple times over 3 decades. The investigation team obtained Harrison's phone records from October 1993 through subpoena of archived telecommunications company records. The process was complicated by the age of the records and changes in corporate ownership over the years, but eventually the team succeeded in reconstructing Harrison's call patterns during the relevant period. The records revealed something unexpected and deeply suspicious. Between October 16th and October 24th of 1993, Harrison had made 17 calls to a specific number registered to a payphone located near a service station on Highway 26, approximately 40 miles northwest of Greenfield. This location sat near the entrance to a vast area of national forest in the Cascade Mountains, a region of dense wilderness with numerous logging roads, abandoned cabins, and remote areas rarely visited by anyone. The frequency and timing of these calls suggested Harrison was either coordinating with someone or checking on something in that area. Sarah assembled a team to travel to the location and investigate. On April 18th, detectives drove to the service station, which had long since closed and been demolished. However, local maps and land records helped them identify structures and properties that had existed in the area during 1993. They discovered that a cabin approximately 3 miles from the payphone location had been owned by Harrison's uncle, Gerald Harrison, who had passed away in 2001. Property records showed the cabin had been abandoned following Gerald's death and eventually reclaimed by the county for unpaid taxes. The cabin's remote location and family connection to Robert Harrison created a compelling theory. If Harrison had abducted Jennifer Mitchell, he would have needed a place to take her, somewhere isolated and under his control. His uncle's cabin fit that profile perfectly, and the phone calls suggested repeated contact with or checking on something in that area during the exact time period when Jennifer had disappeared. Sarah requested and received authorization for a full forensic examination of the old cabin site and surrounding property. The location had been abandoned for over 2 decades, exposed to weather and wildlife, likely significantly deteriorated. However, modern forensic techniques could potentially recover evidence even from severely degraded scenes. The team would need ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and experienced forensic anthropologists if they hoped to find anything after 3 decades. As these plans developed, Sarah made the decision to approach Robert Harrison directly. Now 56 years old and still living in Idaho, Harrison had no outstanding warrants and no legal obligation to speak with Oregon investigators about a 30-year-old case. However, Sarah believed that confronting him with some of the evidence might produce a reaction, possibly even a confession, if Harrison felt the walls closing in around him after years of believing he had escaped consequences. On April 25th, Sarah and 2 other detectives made the drive to Idaho, armed with carefully prepared questions and photographs of Jennifer Mitchell, hoping that after 3 decades, they were finally closing in on the truth of what had happened to the young mother who had vanished from an ordinary grocery store on an autumn afternoon. What they would discover in the coming weeks would exceed even their most disturbing expectations, revealing a depth of calculated cruelty that had allowed one man to steal a life and bury the evidence in the mountains, confident that time and nature would complete the cover-up he had so carefully constructed. Greenfield, Oregon and Meridian, Idaho, May 2023. The drive to Meridian, Idaho took Detective Sarah Coleman and her team nearly 8 hours, crossing state lines and traversing increasingly rural landscape as they moved eastward from Oregon's Willamette Valley into the high desert country of southern Idaho. Robert Harrison's current address, obtained through motor vehicle records and property tax databases, led them to an isolated property 15 miles outside of Meridian proper, accessible only by a long gravel road that wound through sagebrush-covered hills. The remoteness of Harrison's chosen residence seemed to confirm a pattern. This was a man who preferred isolation, distance from neighbors, and the kind of privacy that discouraged unexpected visitors. Sarah had coordinated with Idaho State Police prior to their arrival, following proper protocol for out-of-state investigative work. Local authorities had conducted preliminary surveillance of Harrison's property, confirming that he lived alone in a small manufactured home surrounded by several outbuildings and rusted equipment. Harrison worked as an independent contractor, doing occasional construction and maintenance jobs, employment that allowed him flexible schedules and minimal supervision. His criminal record showed only minor infractions over the years, nothing that would have flagged him to authorities or connected him to unsolved crimes. The investigative team arrived at Harrison's property on the morning of May 2nd, deliberately choosing a weekday morning when their research suggested he would most likely be home. 2 Idaho State Police units accompanied the Oregon detectives, positioned strategically in case Harrison attempted to flee or became confrontational. Sarah had obtained no warrant for arrest or search, as the evidence remained circumstantial and insufficient for criminal charges. This was an interview, technically voluntary, though the presence of multiple law enforcement vehicles made clear that Harrison's cooperation was strongly encouraged. Robert Harrison emerged from his home as the vehicles pulled into his driveway, his expression immediately wary and hostile. At 56, he had aged considerably from his 1993 photographs, his hairline receded and his frame carrying significantly more weight. However, his eyes held the same intense quality visible in his old employee photo, a penetrating stare that seemed to assess and calculate. Sarah introduced herself and her colleagues, explaining that they were investigating the 1993 disappearance of Jennifer Mitchell and had questions regarding Harrison's connection to the case. Harrison's initial response was to claim ignorance of the entire matter, insisting he had no knowledge of anyone named Jennifer Mitchell and no recollection of working at Wilson's Market 3 decades earlier. This obvious falsehood immediately told Sarah that Harrison was prepared to lie, suggesting consciousness of guilt. She calmly presented him with copies of his employment records, forcing him to acknowledge his time at the grocery store. Harrison then shifted his story, admitting he had worked there briefly, but claiming he had no memory of specific customers or incidents from so long ago. Sarah then showed Harrison enhanced images from the security footage, the sequences showing a man matching his appearance following Jennifer through the store, exiting hurriedly, and returning later during the discovery of her disappearance. Harrison studied the images with apparent disinterest, maintaining that the poor quality made identification impossible, and that even if it was him, shopping in a store where he had once worked proved nothing. His demeanor remained controlled, almost rehearsed, as if he had anticipated this conversation and prepared responses. The interview continued for nearly 2 hours in Harrison's driveway, with Sarah methodically presenting evidence: the license plate match, the the suspicious purchases of cleaning supplies and burial materials, the hurried sale of his vehicle, and most significantly, the pattern of phone calls to the remote location near his uncle's mountain cabin. With each piece of evidence, Harrison's explanations became more convoluted and defensive. He claimed the purchases had been for legitimate home projects, that he had sold his car simply because he needed money for his move to Idaho, and that the phone calls had been innocent attempts to reach his uncle about family matters. When Sarah mentioned that investigators were planning to examine his uncle's former cabin property, Harrison's controlled facade cracked momentarily. His jaw tightened, and his hands, previously relaxed at his sides, clenched into fists before he forced them to relax again. He insisted that the cabin had been abandoned for decades, that he had not been there since the mid-1990s, and that searching the property would be a waste of resources. The strength of his reaction to this particular line of inquiry told Sarah that the cabin site was indeed significant, that whatever had happened to Jennifer Mitchell was somehow connected to that remote mountain location. Harrison eventually terminated the interview, invoking his right to legal counsel and ordering the investigators off his property. Sarah had expected this response and had already prepared for the next phase of the investigation. As the team departed Idaho and began the long drive back to Oregon, Sarah contacted the FBI field office in Portland, formally requesting federal assistance given the interstate nature of the case and the possibility that Harrison might be connected to other disappearances. Federal resources would provide additional investigative tools, including more sophisticated forensic capabilities and the authority to pursue evidence across state lines. By May 8th, the FBI had assigned 2 special agents to work cooperatively with the Greenfield Police Department on the Jennifer Mitchell investigation. The combined task force began assembling resources for a comprehensive examination of Gerald Harrison's former cabin property in the Cascade Mountains. Satellite imagery and historical aerial photographs were obtained, showing the property's condition over the decades and identifying potential areas where Earth had been disturbed or structures modified during the relevant time period. The task force also deepened their investigation into Robert Harrison's activities during October and November of 1993. Credit card records, while incomplete due to the age of the data, showed that Harrison had purchased gasoline at stations along Highway 26, the route leading to his uncle's cabin, on 4 separate occasions between October 16th and November 1st. Each purchase had been made in the evening hours, suggesting trips taken under cover of darkness. Store security footage from that era no longer existed, but the pattern of purchases created a timeline of Harrison's movements that aligned with their theory of the crime. Additional interviews with people who had known Harrison in 1993 provided disturbing context. Former co-workers from Wilson's Market described him as someone who became inappropriately fixated on attractive female customers, particularly younger women. One former employee recalled that Harrison had made repeated comments about Jennifer Mitchell specifically in the weeks before his termination, noting that she always shopped alone on Friday afternoons and describing in unsettling detail her routines and patterns. This information had never been reported to police during the original investigation because no one had thought to interview Harrison, as he had already left Greenfield by the time investigators began conducting their most thorough questioning. The task force also discovered that Harrison had maintained contact with several individuals in Greenfield even after his move to Idaho, including a former co-worker who Harrison had apparently confided in about his anger toward the woman whose complaint had led to his firing. This associate, now living in California, agreed to an interview and revealed that Harrison had made disturbing statements about revenge and about making people understand what it felt like to have their lives destroyed by false accusations. While these statements had seemed like empty venting at the time, in hindsight, they suggested a mindset capable of acting on violent impulses. Financial records analysis revealed another troubling detail. In late October 1993, shortly after Jennifer's disappearance, Harrison had withdrawn $800 in cash from his bank account, a significant sum at that time and well beyond his normal spending patterns. He had made no large purchases with traceable payment methods during this period, suggesting the cash had been used for something he wanted to keep hidden. The timing aligned with his purchase of burial materials and his trips to the mountain cabin area. On May 15th, The forensic team assembled at the site of Gerald Harrison's former cabin, now little more than a collapsed roof and rotting walls overtaken by forest vegetation. Ground-penetrating radar equipment was deployed across the property, scanning for anomalies in the soil that might indicate human burial or disturbed earth. Cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains were brought in, working systematically across the acreage surrounding the ruined structure. The search was painstaking and methodical, covering not just the immediate cabin area, but also clearings, logging roads, and potential disposal sites within a half-mile radius. On the second day of the search, one of the cadaver dogs alerted near a dense thicket of trees, approximately 200 yards from the cabin ruins. The area showed signs of old disturbance, though decades of natural growth had obscured whatever had been done there. Ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly in the soil composition at approximately 4 feet depth, consistent with a filled excavation. The forensic team carefully marked the site and began the delicate process of excavation, knowing that anything they found would need to be preserved as evidence for potential prosecution. The dig proceeded slowly over the next several days, with forensic anthropologists supervising every stage to ensure proper documentation and preservation of any remains or evidence. At a depth of 3 feet, the team encountered fragments of plastic sheeting, degraded but identifiable as consistent with the heavy-duty material Harrison had purchased in October 1993. At 4 feet, they discovered bone fragments. By May 19th, the excavation had revealed a complete set of human remains, positioned in a manner consistent with burial rather than natural death and decomposition. The remains were carefully transported to the Oregon State Medical Examiner's office in Portland for complete analysis. Dental records comparison would provide definitive identification, but the physical characteristics of the remains, including approximate age, height, and sex, were all consistent with Jennifer Mitchell. The medical examiner also recovered fragments of fabric and a small silver watch, corroded by time and soil, but still recognizable. David Mitchell would later identify the watch as identical to the one his wife had been wearing on the day she disappeared. Further examination of the burial site revealed additional evidence. Small fragments of what appeared to be denim fabric were recovered, matching the description of the jacket Jennifer had worn. More significantly, forensic analysis of the soil and remaining plastic sheeting detected trace DNA evidence, degraded but potentially viable for comparison testing. The meticulous care with which Harrison had constructed his cover-up had not been sufficient to eliminate all traces of his crime, and modern forensic science could extract information from evidence that would have been unusable 3 decades earlier. On May 26th, dental records definitively confirmed that the remains recovered from the mountain burial site belonged to Jennifer Mitchell. After 30 years of uncertainty, her family finally had confirmation of what they had long suspected, but had never been able to prove. The cause of death could not be determined with certainty due to the decomposition and passage of time, but the manner of death was clearly homicide, the burial location and circumstances ruling out any possibility of accident or natural causes. Armed with this physical evidence, combined with the circumstantial case they had built against Robert Harrison, prosecutors in Oregon obtained an arrest warrant. On May 30th, Idaho State Police, accompanied by FBI agents, executed the warrant at Harrison's property. Harrison was taken into custody without incident, though his expression betrayed no emotion or surprise. He invoked his right to remain silent immediately and refused to make any statement regarding the charges. As he was transported to Idaho's Ada County Jail to await extradition proceedings back to Oregon, investigators began the process of searching his property for any additional evidence that might strengthen their case or connect him to other potential victims. What they would find in Harrison's home would reveal a man who had held on to his secrets for 3 decades, documenting his crime in ways that would ultimately ensure his conviction and provide Jennifer Mitchell's family with answers they had never hoped to receive. Cascade Mountains, Oregon, June 2023. The search of Robert Harrison's Idaho property had yielded results that exceeded even the most optimistic expectations of the investigative team. Inside the manufactured home, Tucked away in a locked filing cabinet in what Harrison used as a home office, investigators discovered a collection of materials that documented not just his crime against Jennifer Mitchell, but a disturbing pattern of obsessive behavior that had continued for 3 decades. Among the files were newspaper clippings about Jennifer's disappearance, articles from local Oregon papers that Harrison had apparently saved and organized chronologically, creating a record of the investigation's progress and eventual descent into cold case status. More disturbing were the photographs. Harrison had kept pictures of Jennifer Mitchell, some apparently taken without her knowledge, during his time working at Wilson's Market. The images showed her shopping, loading groceries into her car, and going about ordinary activities, unaware that she was being documented and watched. The dates written on the backs of these photos ranged from July through September of 1993, demonstrating that Harrison's fixation on Jennifer had developed over months, not spontaneously on the day of her disappearance. Investigators also found a detailed journal, its pages filled with Harrison's handwriting, documenting his thoughts and plans. The entries from September and October of 1993 were particularly revealing, showing a man consumed by rage over his termination from Wilson's Market and increasingly focused on Jennifer as the target of his anger. While the journal never explicitly confessed to murder, the implications were unmistakable. Harrison had written extensively about his uncle's cabin, about its isolation, and the fact that no one ever visited the property, about how the dense forest could keep secrets indefinitely. The journal entries from late October 1993 described trips to the mountains, vague references to problems being solved, and expressions of satisfaction that certain people would never know what had happened. In early November, Harrison had written about his decision to leave Oregon, noting that a fresh start in Idaho would allow him to put the past behind him and move forward with his life. The casual tone with which he discussed relocating, in light of what investigators now knew about Jennifer's burial in the mountains, revealed a chilling capacity for compartmentalization and lack of remorse. DNA analysis of evidence recovered from the burial site provided additional scientific confirmation of Harrison's involvement. Trace DNA extracted from degraded fabric fragments showed a mixture of profiles, with Jennifer Mitchell's DNA identified definitively and a second profile that matched samples obtained from Harrison following his arrest. While defense attorneys would later argue about contamination and the reliability of DNA evidence from such old material, forensic experts testified that the findings were consistent with Harrison having had direct contact with Jennifer and the materials used in her burial. The investigation team also made efforts to determine exactly what had occurred on October 15, 1993. Based on the security footage timeline, witness statements, and Harrison's own documented movements, prosecutors constructed a theory of the crime. Harrison had entered Wilson's Market shortly after Jennifer, following her through the store while she shopped. At some point in an area not covered by security cameras, likely near the back storage or employee areas where Harrison would have been familiar with blind spots, he had confronted Jennifer. Whether Harrison had lured her to a secluded area through deception or had used force remained uncertain, but investigators believed he had somehow incapacitated Jennifer and removed her from the store through a rear exit used for deliveries and trash disposal. This exit was not monitored by security cameras and would have allowed Harrison to move Jennifer to his vehicle without being observed. The white plastic bag he had been carrying when exiting through the front entrance might have contained her personal effects or been a ruse to appear as a normal customer. Harrison had then driven Jennifer to his uncle's remote cabin, a journey of approximately 90 minutes given the mountain roads and distance. What occurred at the cabin could not be determined with certainty, and investigators made no speculation in their reports beyond noting that Jennifer had died there and Harrison had buried her body in the forest. The purchase of plastic sheeting, concrete mix, and burial tools suggested premeditation or, at minimum, a calculated response to cover up his crime. Harrison's return visits to Wilson's Market in the days following Jennifer's disappearance now made sense in the context of his journal entries. He had been monitoring the investigation's progress, observing police activity, and perhaps even deriving satisfaction from watching the community's distress while knowing he held the secret of what had truly happened. This pattern of returning to the scene aligned with behavioral profiles of certain offenders who seek to insert themselves into investigations or experience a sense of power from their hidden knowledge. The investigation also examined whether Harrison might be connected to other unsolved cases. The 1997 disappearance in Idaho that had previously brought Harrison to police attention was reopened and re-examined in light of the Jennifer Mitchell evidence. While no direct connection could be established, the similarities were sufficient to warrant further investigation. Additional cold cases from Oregon, Idaho, and neighboring states were reviewed for potential patterns or connections to Harrison's documented whereabouts over the past 3 decades. By mid-June, extradition proceedings had been completed, and Robert Harrison was transported back to Oregon to face charges. He was formally indicted on counts of aggravated murder, kidnapping, and abuse of a corpse. The prosecution's case was substantial, combining physical evidence, forensic analysis, documented behavioral patterns, and Harrison's own writings to create a comprehensive narrative of premeditated murder and calculated cover-up. Defense attorneys filed numerous motions challenging various aspects of the evidence, particularly the age of the forensic materials and the circumstances of the journal's discovery, but the overall strength of the prosecution's case remained formidable. David Mitchell, now 54 years old, had spent 3 decades living with uncertainty about his wife's fate. The confirmation that Jennifer had been murdered and the identification of her killer brought complex emotions. Relief at finally knowing the truth, renewed grief at having that truth confirmed, and anger at the years stolen by Harrison's successful concealment of his crime. David attended every court hearing, his presence a quiet testament to Jennifer's memory and his determination to see justice served. Emma Mitchell, who had been only 3 years old when her mother disappeared, had grown up with fragmented memories and an absence that had shaped her entire life. Now 33, and with a family of her own, Emma struggled to process the revelations about her mother's death. She had spent her childhood imagining various scenarios, sometimes hoping her mother might still be alive somewhere, unable to return for reasons beyond her control. The finality of knowing Jennifer had been murdered within hours of her disappearance, that she had never had a chance to come home, brought a grief that felt simultaneously fresh and 3 decades old. The community of Greenfield also grappled with the case's resolution. For 30 years, Jennifer Mitchell's disappearance had been one of the town's enduring mysteries, a source of speculation and theories that had never been resolved. The revelation that her killer had been a former grocery store employee, someone who had walked among them undetected, who had attended the same schools and worked in the same familiar places, forced a reckoning with how well anyone truly knows their neighbors and community members. Thomas Reynolds, the evidence custodian whose painstaking review of forgotten footage had initiated the case's reopening, found himself reluctantly thrust into public attention. Local and regional media coverage of the case frequently mentioned his role in discovering the overlooked evidence. Thomas deflected credit, maintaining that he had simply done his job thoroughly, but his dedication had undeniably changed the trajectory of a case that might otherwise have remained unsolved indefinitely. His work also prompted the Greenfield Police Department to implement new protocols for cold case evidence review, ensuring that technological advances would be systematically applied to old cases. As summer progressed and the trial date approached, prosecutors continued building their case, consulting with forensic experts, behavioral analysts, and legal specialists to anticipate defense strategies and strengthen their presentation of evidence. The case against Robert Harrison was strong, but the passage of 30 years between crime and prosecution created unique challenges. Witnesses had died or their memories had faded, physical evidence had degraded, and the legal landscape had changed significantly since 1993. The prosecution team worked tirelessly to address each potential weakness in their case, determined to secure justice for Jennifer Mitchell and ensure that Robert Harrison would finally face consequences for a crime he had believed was perfectly hidden in the mountains. Greenfield, Oregon, September 2023. The trial of Robert Harrison began on September 11, 2023, in the Clackamas County Circuit Court, nearly 10 months after Thomas Reynolds had discovered the forgotten security footage that set the investigation into motion. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathering in adjacent rooms where closed-circuit television displayed the proceedings. Media presence was substantial, with reporters from throughout the Pacific Northwest covering a case that had captured regional attention both for its decades-long mystery and for the remarkable detective work that had finally solved it. Jury selection had taken 3 full days, with attorneys on both sides carefully questioning potential jurors about their ability to fairly evaluate evidence from a crime committed 30 years earlier, their understanding of forensic science, and any preconceptions they might hold about the case based on media coverage. The final jury of 12, with 4 alternates, represented a cross-section of the community, ranging in age from 26 to 68, including individuals who remembered when Jennifer Mitchell first disappeared and others who had not yet been born in 1993. The prosecution's opening statement laid out a comprehensive timeline of Robert Harrison's crime, from his initial fixation on Jennifer Mitchell during his employment at Wilson's Market through his termination, his planning and execution of her abduction and murder, and his 3 decades of living freely while her family suffered without answers. Lead prosecutor Catherine Hayes presented the case methodically, explaining how multiple forms of evidence would combine to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Harrison was responsible for Jennifer's death. Over the following 3 weeks, the prosecution called 42 witnesses, each contributing pieces to the narrative. Thomas Reynolds testified about discovering the security footage and the details he had observed that previous investigators had missed. Detective Sarah Coleman walked the jury through the investigation's progression, explaining how each piece of evidence had led to the next discovery. Forensic experts presented technical testimony about DNA analysis, demonstrating how genetic material recovered from the burial site matched both Jennifer Mitchell and Robert Harrison despite 3 decades of environmental exposure. The enhanced security footage was played for the jury multiple times, with experts explaining the image analysis techniques used to identify Harrison and track his movements through Wilson's Market on October 15, 1993. Former employees of the grocery store testified about Harrison's behavior during his employment, his inappropriate attention to female customers, and his angry reaction to being terminated. These witnesses established Harrison's state of mind and his specific focus on Jennifer Mitchell in the weeks before her disappearance. The journal entries discovered in Harrison's Idaho home were read into the record, with handwriting experts confirming that Harrison had written them. While the journal never explicitly described committing murder, the temporal proximity of certain entries to Jennifer's disappearance, combined with references to the mountain cabin and to problems being permanently solved, created powerful circumstantial evidence of Harrison's involvement. The prosecution argued that these writings demonstrated consciousness of guilt and knowledge of facts that only Jennifer's killer would possess. David Mitchell's testimony proved emotionally compelling. He described Jennifer as a devoted mother and wife, recounting the normalcy of that October morning when he had last seen her alive. He spoke about the 3 decades of uncertainty, the impact on their daughter Emma, who had grown up without her mother, and the profound relief mixed with renewed grief that came from finally learning the truth. His composure and dignity throughout his testimony made a visible impact on the jury. Emma Mitchell also testified, describing what it meant to grow up with a mother who had simply vanished, to have no grave to visit, no closure, no answers to the most basic questions about what had happened. She spoke about how the recovery of her mother's remains and the identification of her killer had paradoxically reopened wounds that had never properly healed, while simultaneously allowing genuine healing to begin. Her testimony humanized the case in ways that forensic evidence alone could not accomplish. The defense strategy focused primarily on challenging the reliability of evidence collected so long after the crime. Harrison's attorneys argued that DNA evidence from such degraded materials could not be considered trustworthy, that the security footage was too poor quality to definitively identify anyone, and that the journal entries were ambiguous and subject to interpretation. They suggested that the prosecution's case relied on speculation and circumstantial connections rather than direct proof of Harrison's guilt. Harrison himself chose not to testify, exercising his constitutional right to remain silent. This decision was legally protected, and jurors were instructed not to draw negative inferences from his choice. But the practical effect was that the prosecution's narrative went unchallenged by any alternative explanation from the defense. Harrison sat impassively throughout the trial, showing no visible emotion during even the most dramatic testimony. The defense called only 7 witnesses, primarily experts who challenged the prosecution's forensic evidence and argued about the limitations of decades-old DNA samples and security footage. Their cross-examination of prosecution witnesses focused on uncertainty, on the gaps in the evidence, on the impossibility of knowing with absolute certainty what had occurred 3 decades earlier. However, the cumulative weight of the prosecution's case proved difficult to counter, as multiple independent lines of evidence all pointed toward Harrison's guilt. Closing arguments consumed an entire day, with both sides presenting their final synthesis of the evidence and their interpretation of what it proved. The prosecution emphasized the convergence of physical evidence, behavioral evidence, documentary evidence, and Harrison's own writings, arguing that each element reinforced the others to create an overwhelming case for guilt. The defense made a final appeal for reasonable doubt, arguing that the passage of time and the degradation of evidence created too much uncertainty for a just conviction. The jury began deliberations on October 2nd, after receiving detailed instructions from the judge about the legal standards they must apply and the elements of each charged crime that the prosecution must prove. The deliberations lasted 2 days, with jurors requesting to review certain pieces of evidence, including the security footage, portions of Harrison's journal, and forensic reports about the DNA analysis. On the afternoon of October 4th, the jury informed the court that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled rapidly as word spread that a decision had been reached. David and Emma Mitchell took their seats in the front row, surrounded by family members who had supported them throughout the ordeal. Robert Harrison showed no reaction as he was led into the courtroom, maintaining the same impassive expression he had worn throughout the trial. The jury filed in solemnly, none making eye contact with the defendant, a sign that experienced court observers noted as typically indicating a guilty verdict. The foreperson confirmed that the jury had reached unanimous verdicts on all counts. The judge asked Harrison to stand as the verdicts were read. On the charge of aggravated murder, the jury found Robert Harrison guilty. On the charge of kidnapping, guilty. On the charge of abuse of a corpse, guilty. Harrison's expression remained unchanged as each verdict was announced, though a slight tightening around his eyes suggested he was not as unmoved as he appeared. Sentencing was scheduled for November 15th, allowing time for the preparation of victim impact statements and for the probation department to complete a pre-sentence investigation report. Under Oregon law, aggravated murder carried a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The additional convictions would add consecutive sentences, ensuring that Harrison would spend the remainder of his life in prison, regardless of any future legal developments or parole considerations. The verdict brought visible relief to Jennifer Mitchell's family. David Mitchell embraced his daughter Emma as tears streamed down both their faces, 3 decades of grief and uncertainty finally acknowledged and validated by the jury's decision. Family members and supporters gathered around them, sharing in a moment of closure that had seemed impossible for so many years. Outside the courtroom, David spoke briefly to assembled media, expressing gratitude to Thomas Reynolds, Detective Sarah Coleman, and everyone who had worked to solve his wife's case and bring her killer to justice. The sentencing hearing in November provided Jennifer's family with the opportunity to directly address Harrison and the court about the impact of his crime. Emma spoke eloquently about growing up without her mother, about the milestones Jennifer had missed, about the grandmother Jennifer would never be to Emma's own children. David described the decades of uncertainty and grief, the way Jennifer's disappearance had cast a shadow over every moment of happiness he had experienced since 1993. The judge sentenced Robert Harrison to life imprisonment without possibility of parole for the aggravated murder conviction, plus consecutive sentences totaling an additional 50 years for the kidnapping and abuse of corpse convictions. In explaining the sentence, the judge noted Harrison's complete lack of remorse, his decades of allowing Jennifer's family to suffer without answers, and the calculated nature of his crime and its cover-up. Harrison was immediately remanded to the custody of the Oregon Department of Corrections, where he would spend the rest of his natural life. Following the sentencing, Jennifer Mitchell's remains were finally laid to rest in a private ceremony at Greenfield Memorial Cemetery. Family and friends gathered to honor her memory and to acknowledge that while justice had come late, it had finally arrived. A headstone was placed bearing Jennifer's name, her dates of birth and death, and the inscription, "Beloved wife, mother, and daughter, forever remembered." The grave provided a physical place for family to visit, something they had been denied for 30 years. The resolution of Jennifer Mitchell's case prompted the Greenfield Police Department to conduct a comprehensive review of other cold cases, applying modern investigative techniques and technology to evidence that had been collected before such methods existed. Thomas Reynolds was promoted to a newly created position overseeing cold case evidence management and review, ensuring that his careful attention to detail would be systematically applied to other unsolved crimes. His work on the Mitchell case became a training example for law enforcement agencies throughout the region, demonstrating the value of thorough evidence review and the application of advancing technology to old cases. For David Mitchell, now 54, and Emma Mitchell, 33, the conclusion of the case marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. The uncertainty that had defined 3 decades was finally replaced with painful but definitive knowledge. They could grieve properly, remember Jennifer without the constant wondering, and begin the process of genuine healing. While nothing could restore the years stolen by Harrison's crime, justice had been served, and Jennifer's memory had been honored through the relentless pursuit of truth by investigators who refused to let her case remain forever unsolved. The forgotten security footage from 1993, overlooked for 3 decades until Thomas Reynolds discovered it in a warehouse box, had ultimately exposed a killer who had believed time and nature had permanently concealed his crime. The case stood as testament to the fact that some secrets, no matter how carefully buried, cannot remain hidden forever, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, can still be achieved through persistence, dedication, and the unwavering commitment to finding truth for those who can no longer speak for themselves.